Good morning, everybody. Welcome to BX. So this session is about behavioral insights approaches around the world. I'm Simon Ruda. I'm a senior director here with responsibility for much of our work with overseas governments. I'm fortunate enough to have been a part of the Behavioural Insights team from the very beginning, when we were just 7 people in what used to be known as the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, trying to be a disruptive but positively disruptive force on Whitehall policy making. Since then, we've come a long way. We're now 190 or so people strong, and it's been an enormous privilege to be able to work with many other governments around the world. At that time, when we were setting up, it was probably just us and Cass Sunstein's team in the White House that existed doing anything like that. So we had to forge our own path and create demand to a certain extent. But I'm now told that there are over 200 behavioral insights functions working in public policy around the world, and we have 5 of the very best of them here today. So it's been a great pleasure to work with some of them. I should say that tomorrow we have another session. Today we're focusing on Europe and the Americas. Tomorrow will be the rest of the world. We're going to hear from each of these representatives of their teams for 10 minutes each. I hope there will be time for questions at the end. If you do want to ask a question, I'm afraid you have to do so via Slido. To do that, you can find it on your web browser or you can download the app. And the code for this specific conference is #D265. And then you find the room, St. James, and then you write your question. And if it's not terrible, my colleagues will give it to me. So that's enough from me. First up, we have Dr. Mariam Chamin. She is the executive advisor for the French Behavioural Insights Unit, which is part of the government of France. Mariam, over to you.
All right, so thank you very much for having me on this panel, and I'm very happy to present to you today. So first of all, the structure of our team and the origins of our team, but then also tell you a little bit more about the insights we gained in really building up this team, and that has been going on for around 3 years, I would say, and even though the team really started in 2014. So first of all, just to give you at one glance some facts about our team. So we are within interministerial directorate, so it's basically a structure that works with different ministries, and we're in charge of diffusing modernization or public transformation. And we depend upon the Ministry of Finance and Economics. But our Behavioral Insights unit is very small. As you'll see, it's a team of six people. So we're 3 cognitive neuroscientists, 1 policy specialist, and 2 behavioral science interns. And we've had 7 past projects, which I'll tell you a bit more about. The difficulties in testing them, but 12 ongoing projects, on most of which we're collaborating with the Behavioral Insights team. And so we also have a specific sub-team in our team that works on forms, simplifying forms or making them more digest, but also a community of behavioral insight practitioners. And we also, the way we work is that we're on a 3-year sunset clause, so we have to kind of prove our efficiency for around 3 to 4 years, and with the budget that was given to us by the government of 2 million, which is quite good, knowing that we started with very little resources. So this is our team. So basically, we have, as I said, a person working specifically on forms, but the rest of our team is really about delivering behavioral insight interventions. And our collaborations are, I would say, 90% of them with the behavioral insights team and 10% with a French agency that is made of specifically researchers, French researchers, basically. So as a lot of behavioral insights teams, our main mission really is to enhance the quality and the delivery of public policies, but also a big part is to evaluate the impact of our interventions. And so, yeah, a lot of our time is really designing and delivering these behavioral insights interventions, but also trying to build up knowledge and information about what really works. and contributing to a culture of evidence-based policy making, but also providing advice to different administrations on BI capacity building. So I'm getting all of these things out of the way just that I can focus on something that's more interesting maybe to you, which are the insights that we gained in setting up the team. So our method, I won't go on that very long. It's very similar to very different team methods, so diagnostic and understanding the problem we have to work on, and then testing the solutions that we come up with. Okay, so now that that's done, I'm going to get to the more interesting part maybe for you, which is what have we learned in really like building from scratch this team, and in very complicated conditions because there was a change in government and also with very little resources. And so I'm going to present to you 8 insights. So first of all, the amount of creativity that or adaptability that we had to put in trying to do things that were basically from training public agents to behavioral insights applications, bringing them on board because we were a very small team of 1 person. And so that took a lot of perseverance. But then eventually, with the government change, we got funding, and that progressively led us to this team of 6. And so the first thing we really started doing, because there wasn't a lot of buy-in at first, there was a bit of skepticism about whether it was manipulation, what exactly are you doing, is it small gadget, fly in the urinal type of intervention. So we had to really make it very clear what we're going to deliver and get the expectations right about what it's going to be. And we also worked a lot on the ethics in the first part of our existence. And so having all these shared standards and reassuring kind of the community around us about what it's going to be took us a lot of time, and I think it was quite important to start with. And then maybe this is one of the things that's the most difficult, and it's still very difficult for us, is striking the right balance between scientific method and the rigor of really doing things in a way that you're proud of, but also meeting policymakers' needs, because policymakers obviously want solutions for yesterday, and our experiments take a lot of time. It takes 6 months to 1 year, and that's really a minimum. So it's really important to try to find that balance. And one thing which I think it was maybe we would do it differently if we could go back in time, is at first we were extremely, we really wanted RCTs or nothing else, like high-end scientific experiments, or else we refused projects. And I think that if we go back in time, I would say that even doing a mean or a median on Excel would be just good enough. And even if it's not a lab-perfect experiment, it's important to just do it, because all of these are small seeds of diffusing the culture of experimentation. Also, one thing which we maybe didn't get right from the start, but now we're putting much more emphasis on it, is working with the right partners. And this means that obviously they need to be motivated and engaged till the end, but also people who in the end will be able to change things on the ground. So we are in a position that can actually lead to results in the end. And I hope now with the partners we're working with, we kind of got there a bit more. And another thing is, at the beginnings of our unit, we try to make it very simple, try to explain everything we're doing in very simple terms so that people understand and buy in, but that also led to oversimplification and some sort of gadgetization of like, what's your catalog of solution for this and that. So I think it's important also to explain what it is, and that it needs an important expertise, and it's not that simple. So what about criteria? So after our first 2 years, 2016, 2017, we finally got the grant to be able to launch projects, and so we had to set criteria to pick the right project. So what we did is we launched the call for projects for different administrations to come up to us with their projects, and we asked them to fit these 4 criteria, or else we wouldn't take the project. So it was different than what we did at first, which was going to ministries and asking them to do work with them. And I think the 2 most important really are making sure that the administration knows that the problem is really behavioral and not structural. And that's, of course, we help them identify what is behavioral or not, but also the availability of data and making sure the administration knows that it's important to experiment. And also what could be facilitating is finding experiments that have been done in other countries where you have high chances of replication, relatively fast implementation, and good return on investment. That's something that helped us. And also, of course, choosing the collaborations in a good way. And we're very happy to collaborate on a lot of our projects with the Behavioral Insights team because of the scientific rigor and experience they have in experimentation, but also having the right researchers on board. So knowing also that we can't do everything and that there's a lot of knowledge to get outside of our team. So in my 2 last minutes, I would summarize by saying that maybe the biggest challenge we had in our team is really experimentation and convincing administrations that it's important to test and that we're not just here to give you ideas or insights about behavior, even though it's a big part of our work. And so on a lot of projects we did, there was no experimentation, not even qualitative research experimentation to know what people thought. There was only one experiment that was really trialed, and it was actually quite a big RCT that was done on 2.5 million French citizens. But it's the only one. It's the one that actually allowed us to create this team. But now we hope that in our upcoming projects we'll be able to do more trials. And so the upcoming ones are these 7 that are currently ongoing. So we have an experiment on preventing sleep deprivation in children, but also things like working on fighting stereotypes on disabled job seekers or reducing overprescription of antibiotics and other projects. And we also have actually 5 additional projects coming up on screen addiction or digital inclusion, for example, and youth employment. And I think maybe my favorite would be on consumer protection. So how do you work on making consumers much more aware about the way maybe marketing sometimes can abuse of certain biases or habits? And so that's one project that I'm happy to work on. And finally, so yeah, this is not an error in the slide, but as some people thought. But when I was thinking about this slide, it was not easy to find. It's always difficult to post about your greatest achievement. And I think the fact that we built this team and came up with all of the things I showed you was was something we're proud of. But I think the most proud moment, at least recently in our team, was when the head of our HR and also the person who validates all our budgets, Jean-Michel, the most skeptical person of all, who kept on making fun of us with our flies in the urinal, and he didn't miss an opportunity to joke about our team, was actually the first person to register to our latest event, which is Behavioral Insights Applied to Management. And yeah, it was a moment we celebrated in our team, and we thought, like, if we convince Jean-Michel, then we have hope for the rest. And so, yeah, so basically that's it. And so thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mariam. Mariam is being modest. I think she has done an absolutely fantastic job to set up the relevant structures to pursue the work of her team in France at the center of that administration. Now we're going to hear different experience from Florencia. Florencia is a lead economist at the Inter-American Development Bank, where she leads the Behavioral Economics Group, she just reminded me I last saw her in Buenos Aires a couple of years ago, and I can't wait to find out about how she's developed her work since then.
Hello, a pleasure being here. So for those of you who don't know what the Inter-American Development Bank, we are the main lending multilateral organization for Latin America, with about $15 billion a year, benefiting our 26 beneficiary countries in Latin America. And the IDB is composed of 57 countries, so there are the donors and the beneficiaries. So we've been, just a little bit about the history and how it was born. We've been experimenting in our loans with savings, education, fiscal issues, taxation issues, and social issues for about 10 years. But the thing was growing so big, it grew so big, the scale was so big that 2 years ago, we decided to create this behavioral economics group about 2017. And I start from the end. I think this was our biggest achievement, to create this group, because in a development bank, this is not a bankable topic. A loan for schools or to build hospitals is millions of dollars for a country like Colombia or Argentina or Brazil. But these light touch nudges are not expensive. So how are you going to build a loan behind this topic? So I think that was our greatest achievement, to create this group whose objective is to advise governments on how to build better policies with a better understanding on human behavior. Beyond this thing of the scale, we grew so big that it made sense to create this group. There was another rationale for that. Why to have this group in a development bank? The traditional way we were working was about structural barriers, incentives, changes of prices, changes of regulations. If a teacher doesn't want to teach in a rural school, let's increase his wage. If there is not enough attendance to schools in some remote area, let's build schools. But let me give you an example of how this was not enough for the problem of development. In El Salvador, half of the babies suffer from anemia, which is very important for cognitive development. Our usual traditional way of working would be to lift the structural barriers, distributing these green sachets of chispitas nutricionales, or micronutrients, that are the best way to fight anemia. So in El Salvador, we successfully distributed these micronutrients to 82% of the families, and with that, we have been considered a successful loan. So our work could have finished just there. But where is the behavioral problem? When we went to those households and find out that just a fourth of the mothers were giving and consuming appropriately the micronutrients, we realized the impact was not being achieved and that there was not enough by lifting the structural barriers. Oops. So the mission of this group is to use behavioral insights to improve welfare and human capital. To put it in one line, there are many other objectives around there, and we have two main objectives. The first is to generate evidence on cost-effective solutions based on our clients' demand, and in this objective, I would like to highlight we have three main activities. The first is about advice, policy dialogue, and interacting with governments to see how we can be helpful on the design of their policies. The second is about field experiments, so it's trying small things to then scale them up to the policy level. And the third is about dissemination. We have a blog, we have a website, we have publications, and I invite you to get in touch if you want to disseminate anything related to Latin America. The second objective is about capacity building, is supporting staff and government in acquiring behavioral insight skills. The structure is with a coordination at the research department, which works well because it's separated from the operational part of the bank. My colleague, Carlos Escartacin, is in that department. And then we have sector focal points, one person in the fiscal department, one person in the infrastructure department, one person in the social department, and visiting scholars, for which we have always openings, job openings available. And then that gets to the field by the project team leader. So the project team leader in Nicaragua or El Salvador will be in touch with Washington through that structure. Then I wanted to emphasize this, the academic arm we built with my colleagues, which is the LACEA brain. What is LACEA? LACEA is the Latin American Economic Association. It's the second largest economists association after the American Economic Association, and it has networks relating to topics. They have a network on poverty, a network on crime, And last year, we came to LACEA and said there is not such a network as the behavioral economics. So we built and we created the LACEA Brain Network. BRA is Behavioral, I is Insights and N Network. And we hosted the first meeting in Washington, D.C. in June this year. We had 72 paper submissions, 20 papers accepted, and it was a really nice atmosphere and academic exchange. And the next LACEA Brain 2020 is going to be in Montevideo, Uruguay, because you're going to see in a second that we are supporting the nudge unit there. So stay tuned, because a call is going to be opening in October to present papers. Where are we working? Pretty much in every Latin American country, a little bit slowly in Central America and the Caribbean. And to put some examples, we are trying to increase attendance in preschool in Brazil, Uruguay and Colombia, reducing cardiovascular risk with nudges in Argentina, promoting retirement savings for independent workers in Chile and Colombia and Mexico, promoting parenting skills in Jamaica, et cetera, et cetera. You have many examples there. Topics, to put them more in black and white, many in education, taxation, health, savings, crime, gender, climate change, and we are building up in citizen security, transportation, and water. So now I'm going to give you the 4 projects we are most proud of. I'm going to be quick. As you know, the problem we have in Latin America is that PISA scores are really low. The achievement of students is very related to teacher quality, but it happens that the best teachers choose to teach in the best schools and not in the worst schools. So beyond the low scores, there is also a gap by socioeconomic status. So we partner with the Secretary of Education of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil to have an introspection exercise run just before each teacher had to choose in which school to teach. And the introspection exercise is that thing you're seeing on the left. You have to write down, why did you decide to become a teacher? And there it says, because I think I'm capable of changing people and build a better society. So we were priming their intrinsic motivations, and just with that simple exercise, we got some of those teachers to go and teach in those schools that most needed, and as you see, it was about 8 percentage points increase. Another big problem in Latin America and in the world is that cardiovascular diseases are #1 cause of death. Because there are no symptoms and the risk is not salient to high-risk patients, then there is a high risk of procrastinating and not going to the health center. So in Argentina, we built an experiment with 3 arms, control group, and SMS reminders. David was talking about the things that didn't work. The SMS reminders to go to the first health visit didn't work, by the way. And an incentive, I'm calling it incentive, but it's the possibility of entering a lottery to win a voucher for $20 for the closest supermarket, so a really small incentive, caused a doubling of double the number of people coming to the first and the second visit, which is the main and the most important thing to tackle high-risk patients of cardiovascular diseases in Argentina. Okay, the third is about pushing girls to undertake STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in Mexico, and we are sending letters about role modeling. 1 minute, okay? And we are partnering with CIDE there. And before going to my next slide, I forgot to mention that in the micronutrients experiment, we are partnering with the behavioral insight teams, and we are doing great work in El Salvador and scaling up to Central America. My last slide, and one we are really proud of, is that we are supporting the first nudge unit in Latin America. Simon was in Buenos Aires for this Proyecto de la Fundación INECO, is the neuroscience foundation that is building up a nudge unit to serve Chile and Argentina. It's in its early stages. However, this year, Uruguay, the president's office, has decided to launch a lab to try behavioral sciences. 2 million, what that ad says there is that they put 2 million Uruguayan pesos, which is quite some money, to fund 10 projects from the government ministries and 20 projects from the academia to try behavioral insights in public policies. And that's why the next La Sea Brain conference is going to be held in Montevideo, Uruguay, because I think it's a nice combination of the academic part and the policy making and how they are building up these ideas into the government. Thank you. If you scan that, you get our website and all the materials you need to know more about the IDB Behavioral Economics Group.
Noted, for the Behavioural Insights team will provide QR codes when directing you to Slido in the future. So next up, we have Dr. Alexandra van Geen, who is a decision science specialist from the Netherlands Authority for Financial Markets. Thank you.
All right, I'm so happy to be here. Let me tell you a bit about who I am and what we do. So I'm Alexandra van Geen. I'm an economist, and I work at the Authority of Financial Markets in the Netherlands. And specifically, I work at our consumer behavior team. So the AFM is something in structure very similar to the FCA in the UK. So what we are is we are a market conduct authority, and we have to make sure that the financial markets indeed function properly in the Netherlands. Now, the consumer behavior team is relatively new. We started in 2016. I'm happy to say we're a quite large group. We're 12 people, also quite diverse. So we have economists, we have psychologists, we have people with a policy background, and we have people with a communication background. We have a very evidence-based approach. So we like to do experiments. We like to be on top of the academic literature, and in that way, help supervision to be more effective and more efficient. And what we believe is crucial in this is to improve the financial choice architecture that consumers face, because we think that is what is crucial to determine if your financial decision making is sound. Because a lot of the architecture now is online, we focus a lot on online A/B experiments as well. All right. So I think our team has 3 different types of achievements. Let me go through them very quickly. So one of them is influencing policy. So we've been focusing a lot on national policy, but we're also looking at European policy because that affects us as well. So what we see to do there is to see if policy indeed incorporates behavioral insights in the right way, and if not, or if something's missing, we might seek to influence that. Second type of achievement is improving choice architecture. So we do that in 2 ways, either directly with financial institutions, doing experiments with them, or by designing tools that enable our supervision to, in a more structured way, evaluate the decision architecture that financial institutions have. Lastly, we're focusing on the operationalization of regulation. So with that I mean is there's a lot of regulation in place, but there's quite some scope for supervision to interpret that and to choose how to supervise. So we look at that from a behavioral lens and see, okay, how can we interpret that in a way that's most effective and will improve financial decision making the most? So I have some examples for each of those 3. So for influencing policy, I think one major aim of the Dutch government is to seek that people do not borrow irresponsibly. They don't take credit if they shouldn't be taking credit, basically. So the law they implemented was that all financial credit providers should have a warning. And that warning read literally, beware, borrowing costs money. So I'm here in a room full of behavioral enthusiasts. So I guess that many of you probably share my skepticism, because we kind of know that information doesn't really do much, right? So we were skeptical as well. And what we did is we did some experiments to see, we randomized this warning, like took it away or didn't take it away, and look at behavior. And what did we find? Well, unsurprisingly, it didn't have to do anything. So people didn't borrow differently, they didn't take a higher amount, they were less likely to take any loans, didn't do anything. Didn't have any behavioral implications. So we communicated it back to the government, and now they're together with us trying to find a way that does actually change behavior, that does improve credit taking of consumers. But I'll tell you a bit more about that later on in the presentation. Improving choice architecture. So one example that we recently did together with a financial institution is the following. So in the Netherlands, and I'm pretty sure in your country this is the same thing, what you see oftentimes is that phone companies offer free phones. So if you take a subscription, you get a free phone. Now, this is not really a free phone, I have to tell you. This is actually a kind of hidden way of credit, right? So basically, every month you pay a higher amount to pay for your phone. So we recognize that as well in the Netherlands. This is actually a way of giving credit. Well, if that is true, then of course, these phone companies also need to abide by the same rules as financial institutions that offer credit to to consumers. And one of these rules is that they have to have a good idea of who the consumer is they are serving to make sure that the product is actually suitable for them. And that means that they have to ask for income and they have to inquire about the expenditures of their potential client. So they did that in their online application form. They asked about income and expenditures. What they also did was they already pre-filled that for the clients, for the consumers. So they already pre-filled pre-filled the income, and they pre-filled the expenditures. So basically, what you just had to do is click enter, and lo and behold, you have your phone. Now, we were not very happy about that because anchoring literature suggests that, people, first of all, they take that as advice, and second of all, that might mean that a lot of people who actually, have not the income and the expenditures stated there would actually hit OK and would get a credit that they shouldn't get. So we were critical. We went to the phone companies. We said, hey, guys, we don't like this. And what they said is that, oh, actually, we're doing a big service to the consumers here because they face big difficulties giving reasonable answers here, and we guide them in the right way. So they felt they were actually doing something right. So we asked them to test that. We asked them to do an RCT. They did that. What we found, indeed, big anchoring effects, and indeed, people got credit who shouldn't get credit. So we also convinced these phone companies now to stop pre-filling. And I must say they were actually very, very helpful with this. But that's one way we improve the choice architecture. Operationalization of regulation. So in European regulation, so MiFID requires financial institutions that offer a product that has some investment component to have a good idea about the risk profile of their clients to make sure that the product is indeed fitting for them. So this risk attitude elicitation is mandatory. Now, when we looked at what people were doing in practice, we were quite unhappy what we saw. So some of these companies were asking how good people slept if they lost money. Other companies were inquiring about the behavior when buying a fridge. And mind you, these were all investment products, so we thought that they weren't doing a very good job. So what we did there was together, with the financial insights that we have, just from an economics and finance perspective, but also with behavioral insights perspective, we made sure that we had 5 conditions, and I want to go over them next. There we go. So we made 5 conditions that we felt that a successful risk attitude elicitation method should have. So we didn't want to be prescriptive, but we wanted to give them some guidance as what that should satisfy. And what we also did is we tested methods that satisfied these criteria to check their performance, also in contrast to the performance of the elicitation methods that have been in place so far, and we saw that they actually outperformed them. So this enables our supervision, but also the financial institution to have a better idea of what they should do when elicit risk preferences. Because mind you, this is super, super difficult. Also in economics, also in finance, also from a behavioral insight perspective, we're still struggling. The debate is still struggling. Academics are still struggling. So it is a difficult question, but it's also an important question because if you want to have a good fitting financial product for your client, you should make sure that the risk preference is actually fitting the product. I don't want to go over them because I think I'm now in time, so I'll just go to the next slide. But trust me, I'm super happy to talk more about this, so just come and find me if you're interested. So what are the lessons learned? So I think for us, what we learned, the most important thing is that it's important to convince the internal organization. So in one sense, we are new because we have this behavioral insight thing that we want to, what would it we want to, that we want to improve in the organization or establish in the organization. But on the other hand, we're also evidence-based. So we really care about the data. We want to test. We were kind of like nerdy academics. Like that's also maybe not very fitting in that organization. So we really have to work hard on proving that what we're doing is actually worthwhile. And it's sometimes indeed it is worth the wait for an experiment that might take a year. That's difficult, and we're working on that. And we're doing management training to make sure we have a lot of support from the top, but also with supervision to make sure that people actually find us and share their problems with us. Another thing we learned is that it's oftentimes quite hard to influence policy, and national policy is relatively easy, but especially when you look at policy that's mandated by Europe, which has a lot of stakeholders involved and a long time frame, it's quite hard to influence. And sometimes it's more pragmatic to just accept the laws that are in place and just do the best you can with that from a behavioral angle. So that's something we do as well. Thirdly, and I could give a whole presentation on this, but supervising RCTs from a distance is super hard. So we're doing RCTs ourselves, but oftentimes we're working with financial institutions and we just get, either we don't even get their data, now increasingly we do, although it's also a pain from a privacy perspective, but that's something else. But to just make sure everything goes right, that the randomization goes well, that the data is reliable, that's just complicated. And we've learned so much, and I think we're doing a very, very good job, and I'm super proud of it, but it's definitely difficult. All right, for the future, so what are we now currently doing? So we will soon publish some principles on choice architecture that will enable supervisors to have discussions with financial institutions in a more structured way. And I think this is quite cool. So what we're doing is we're shifting the burden of proof to the financial institutions. So they have to prove to us that the choice architecture that they offer to clients is indeed helping to improve financial decisions of their customers. And I think that will help us a lot. A second thing we're working on, and that is also in response to this earlier credit warning that I mentioned, is we're doing some really cool field experiments with a big online credit provider to see how the choice architecture both influences borrowing and repayment behavior. And we have some really cool results, some effects of anchoring and also other aspects of the decision environment that actually changes behavior. So that will come shortly. And thirdly, we're now also actively thinking, also because we grew as a group, we're now 12 people, to become more mature in the organization. So we want to make sure that we solve the right problems, we do it in the right way, and we do it in a more structured way. So that's something we're working on right now as well. All right, I think my 10 minutes are up. It's great to be there, and come and find me if you want to talk more.
Thank you very much. Right, next up we have Dr. Sabrina Artinger. Sabrina is the head of citizen-centered government at the German Federal Chancellery. This includes both the policy lab and the behavioral and social science team. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Like all of us, I'm incredibly happy to be here today. And I have a first question for you. So, do you have a policy lab in your country? If so, please raise your hand. Okay, so, and who of you have collaborated with your policy lab before? Yeah, some of you do, yeah. Today I'm here to tell you a little bit about experience with the marriage of the two concepts, putting behavior insights and a more citizen-centered approach in the design of policy interventions together, and how we've been doing this in Germany. So, yeah. We've talked about that. Citizen-centered government is the title of our unit. And we've started out, basically, the foundation was the coalition treaty of the last legislation period, where the federal government agreed upon that they want to improve the impact of political projects by increasingly developing political projects from the perspective and with the direct involvement with citizens, it's actually called in German. And so that's what we've been doing, and we've been trying to understanding the way regulation is done so far in Germany and how we could put the citizen sides of things and also the implementation aspects more upfront, because currently regulation is very heavily dominated by a regulatory logic in Germany. So we've been thinking quite a lot about how we can use what we know from behavior insights, but also what we know from the methodology that we have in co-creation, how to inform the regulatory process very early on in the doing. So our overall goal is to reach more empowerment and more involvement of citizens for the sake of better regulation, but also better services. So before I go into how we work, let me tell you where we started. So we started as a very small team in the Federal Chancellery, in the staff of policy planning with 3 people. And we've been trying out ideas how to combine behavior insights, policy lab ideas into our national way of regulation. And we've been working very intensely with the federal ministries in order to understand the structures that are actually necessary to do so. We've been doing this for 3 years and quite successfully, obviously, because they have installed us as a standing unit a year ago. So we are now part of the general structure within the German Federal Chancellery in the DG for Digitalization, Innovation and Policy Planning. So how we work is, I think, combining different methodologies. So, of course, like all of us, we are looking into the literature. What do we know? What evidence do we have behaviorally? We are also talking a lot with experts in practice, but administration as well. And we engage a lot in qualitative research early on in the stage, so really understanding the context, sometimes even by ethnographic methods, and understanding well what we are actually dealing with when we think about a specific piece of regulation that has to be thought through. And then the second stage, I think, is what makes this approach very special to our work in Germany, is that we focus on citizen-centered solution and co-creation in the developmental stage. So we co-create and co-design in a team of behavioral scientists, but also people within the federal ministries who are actual lawmakers and citizens, and in a different in different forms of formats that we have been developing throughout the years in order to do so. And then ideally we test the invented or developed interventions in the field, ideally with randomized controlled trials. And it, also for the German case, this is restricted sometimes by data protection, sometimes it is also restricted by other practical issues. But our experience has been that this becomes easier and easier to actually make the case that RCTs are possible and that it is really worth the effort. And so through having a history of projects that we can show off to the ministries, we get more support in actually going forward with RCTs. So I said that before, co-creating solutions that work with the idea of empowering people and boosting competences. That is something that we have a very heavy focus on, and that also has been showing to be really an endeavor worthwhile, and that worked out in a number of projects quite well. Cooperation with the federal ministries, I already talked about that a bit. So we've been thinking about changing how regulation is done in Germany from the perspective of, well, if you want to create change, you have to go out and really work with the people and really understand also their side of things. So when I started working at the federal ministry as a behavioral scientist, I first of all learned how to how the training of my colleagues in the federal ministries was, how law is made and how the timeframes are and what their requirements are for an intervention to be really well fit into this process. So we really try to be as close as possible from the very beginning, and to be honest, this hasn't always been easy because, of course, we come from different backgrounds. Most of our colleagues at the federal ministries are lawyers. They don't have an empirical background, so you have to do a lot of talking to find a joint language. But I think we've come to a point that we see that it was really worthwhile developing the approach together with the federal ministries and those who actually write the law. Yeah, here's some examples of projects, most of which have been completed. And as you can see, there's a wide range of topics, as I think all of us are working on, and also a wide range of federal ministries that have already been engaging in projects. And what we are seeing currently is a growing appetite, which for us is really, really interesting to see that we, I think, are now at a phase where there's a little bit of a momentum for this movement, and I think it gets along quite a bit with the digitalization process that is happening in Germany and is pushed forward, and that puts the user in the center, and the idea of citizen-centered or user-centered design becomes more obvious and more pronounced in their thinking. So I think even though we started working like 4 years ago, it's now the moment that the idea of thinking policies through from the side of the citizens and the users becomes much more salient to the administrators. Yeah, our most frequently requested policy lab formats are the process labs. So we're thinking through processes with regulators, but primarily also with those who are involved in processes. We assist regulation by re-evaluating or evaluating certain aspects of regulation that is under discussion. And we have a form lab, and I think the idea is quite similar to the French idea. So this, for us, this includes digital forms as well, so any form where a citizen interchanges information with a communal authority or just with the government. Declaring your taxes in Germany is terrible. We've worked on this. I think we could come up with some ideas, but it's still very difficult. And at least in Germany, I can say there's a lot of room for this kind of work as well. So far, we have been working with close to 36,000 citizens so far that have been engaged in either developing interventions, understanding the problem better, or testing the interventions in the field. So, yeah, thank you very much. If I may make a suggestion, so if you haven't worked with a policy level approach or co-creation, I would just ask you to try it out and let us know what your experiences are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and with apologies for making you wait, we've saved the best till last. We're very excited to hear from Liz Hardy, who is the Senior Lead for Behavioural Insights at the Impact and Innovation Unit in the Government of Canada.
It's always fun to go last, but I am pleased to be here. Thanks so much. So I'm from the Impact Innovation Unit. We are housed at Privy Council office in the Government of Canada, so we work at the federal level. And slightly, I think, maybe different than my co-presenters here. We do have more business lines than just behavioral insights. So we do work in innovative funding and partnerships, which is working with social impact bonds, pay for success models, that sort of thing. Impact measurement, we have a specialization in impact measurement, so helping the government more effectively measure our programs and services to ensure that we are in fact delivering where we should be. And then finally, why we're all here today, the behavioral insights practice, where we apply behavioral science to public policy issues across the Government of Canada, across the country. So I started this unit. I arrived in Ottawa about 4 years ago now in 2015, and I'm surprised today to see sort of how we've evolved as a team and as an organization. When I began, we certainly were a late adopter of BI, certainly in Canada, but then also compared to other countries around the world, to now a place where we are applying behavioral science to new policies and programs versus traditionally just kind of fixing what we've already broken. Looking at when we're rolling out new policies, how can we use behavioral science to design them sort of quote unquote right the first time. And certainly our demand for services has increased greatly. One of the reasons for that was an experimentation direction that came out a few years ago. A direction came out from our Treasury Board Secretariat in partnership with Privy Council Office to tell departments or to encourage departments, don't want to use the word mandate, but encourage departments to start experimenting with their programs and services. And at that point, of course, things sort of got a bit busier for the team, which led us to launch a fellowship program. And here you'll see kind of our team structure. So essentially we have what I sort of refer to as a satellite model. We have a small core team of researchers that operate out of Privy Council Office. In addition to that, I hire behavioral scientists from outside government into our team and then send them out to various departments and agencies across the organization on a chargeback basis. So their salaries are reimbursed back to Privy Council Office. Now, this allows us to have a central team where we're still connected. We meet about every week or every 2 weeks as a cohort to talk about our research, the challenges we're facing, but then our scientists and our researchers go back to the departments to help start building that capacity in departments. And one of the reasons we decided to do this was, well, there were a few reasons, but one of the main reasons was that we were finding that we would work with a department or an agency on a particular policy area. We would design the experiment, we would design the interventions, we would do the testing, and we would hand the results back to the department and say, okay, here you go. This is what worked, this is what didn't work, and this is how we recommend you moving forward. But the department and the staff didn't really learn too much more about experimentation. They didn't really fully understand how the experiment was designed. This way, with our researchers embedded in policy areas, they're able to sort of start building that capacity. So currently we have over 30 projects underway. I'm obviously not going to go through all of them, but I just wanted to draw some attention to a few that I think are of particular interest. As some of you may know, Canada has legalized cannabis. So in 2018, cannabis became legal in Canada. Very exciting, lots of work around that obviously occurred. So one of the things we're doing is trying to increase the number of micro-growers, so similar to microbreweries, micro-growers of cannabis to become regulated. We're also looking at pro-environmental consumer behaviors, so how can we integrate behavioral insights into Canada's national circular economy strategy? And then finally, integrating BI and human-centered design, something, of course, my other panelists also mentioned, and I think we heard this morning from David, how we can think about using different kind of approaches like human-centered design into the way that we deliver our programs and services, and in particular, how we think about our granting process. So as a federal organization, a federal government, a lot of our business is granting money to other kind of delivery agents to help kind of deliver on all our policies and programs. So how can we incorporate BI into that process? So in addition to providing some high-level information about some of our projects, I wanted to do a bit more of a deeper dive into one of our more recent initiatives, and this comes back to my point around cannabis legalization. So cannabis became legal in 2018, and as a result, we had individuals with simple cannabis possession charges that had not been pardoned. So have these charges for a substance that now has become legal. So there was interest in obviously creating a new sort of less intensive process for them. I don't think I need to tell you the benefits of having an individual be pardoned or receive a record suspension, is what we call it in Canada, and that includes obviously access to employment and housing, so certainly something that's really critical for this population. So we began in sort of what we call, or what I think Cass sort of coined, the sludge audit. So looking at sort of the burdens that are in place in the current process. There's a 10-step process. One of the steps involves a very lengthy documentation burden, which does include actually showing up to the court that charged you in person to request your court documents. So let's say you're now, and I don't have a map of Canada, Canada's a very large country, you're living on the East Coast, but you were charged on the West Coast, you need to travel all the way there, stand in line at the court in Vancouver, for instance, and then receive the document in person. That's just one small part of one of the steps that's required for an individual to actually get through and receive a pardon. So we went through all the documentation and streamlined the process considerably. That process was recently launched a few months ago now. So right now we're just looking at the impact of that. But this is the first time the Government of Canada has incorporated behavioral science on a new program and service, versus, as I said earlier, which is focusing on the stuff that's sort of already out there, already realizing that is not working. We're starting to think about behavioral insights, thank you, as we sort of build and launch these programs. Now, sort of putting aside the specific work and thinking about, we were asked to sort of think through some lessons learned. I think there are many. I'll focus on 3 today. The first was the creation and launch of the fellowship program as a chargeback model. So as I mentioned, the salary in dollars are reimbursed back to Privy Council. Now this allowed me, I suffered through the 3-person team for several years, and now with the fellowship model, I'm actually able to grow the team. I have 10 now, and hoping again to continue to expand in the next few years. It allowed me to expand without increasing my budget or my staff count. The second one I would say is about implementation. This one's hard. We can't, as practitioners, assume that implementation will follow an impactful result. That's been a very hard lesson, I think, for all of us, to sort of understand that path dependence and risk aversion are hard things to overcome, and in some cases, unfortunately, no level of evidence is enough. And finally, as the practice of BI evolves, we'll begin to see, as I previously mentioned, a more multidisciplinary approach, which I think is really exciting. Thinking about how we can incorporate design thinking methodologies in certain areas of our process, like in the design phase particularly. When we're designing our interventions, how can those insights help us design, more effective interventions? And finally, what's next? Certainly excited that we will be seeing our team expand to local governments. One thing I think all of you can appreciate is at the federal level, it's sometimes difficult to get access to citizens to have those touch points. So by partnering with other levels of government, particularly in Canada, local governments will be able to, test, I think, some more impactful interventions. A focus on using BI internally. So BIT released a report fairly recently on a behavioral government. That certainly resonated with our decision makers in Canada. It's something that I think we'll turn our attention to. How can we better improve decision making within our own organization? And finally, of course, further advancing and supporting the Canadian landscape on behavioral insights. So thank you with that. I hope you'll be asking us some questions on Slido, and I'm around after if anyone has any questions. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Fascinating collection of talks, almost overwhelming, in fact, particularly interesting. It resonates very much with some of our experiences in the Behavioural Insights team, things like implementation doesn't necessarily follow an impactful trial result. Fascinating to see the similarities. Could we give them another microphone, please? So we have lots of questions, you'll be pleased to know. We won't have time to go through them all. I'm going to pick some of them. Panel, please don't feel obliged to all comment on everything unless you really want to. There'll be plenty of questions, but let's just see how it goes. So the first question is really an ask for examples, I guess, of where rigor was compromised for policymaker needs. So who would like to comment on that? I think, did you bring it up, Mariam?
Is this working? Can someone hear me? So rigor being compromise for policymaker needs, we have a lot of examples, but I think one which were maybe a more recent one that it's a choice that we're going to have to make right now on an upcoming project, which is going to be on fiscal transparency. So making it very clear how the way taxes are distributed when you pay taxes, and so we were called by the Ministry of Economics and Finances to do such a project. And at first we were very ambitious in the time that we're going to take and then to design this experiment, and we actually started doing a literature review which showed that it's going to be a very, we have to be very careful in the way we do this. And so we planned out a whole experimentation, plan, and for about 1 year. But then when we went and presented it to the ministry, they laughed at us, saying that we only had 3 months to do it, and so now we're going to have to make a very important decision on whether to put rigor and everything that it requires to do this project correctly aside and do this in 3 months. And I think given the experience that we have with other projects, I think we're going to do it in the most try to put experimentation in any case on the side going on, and even if the delivery of the project is going to be done in the required time, we're still going to continue experimenting with the sample and then maybe giving feedback along the way. So I think, sometimes, of course, we're not in a lab. We have to go with this compromise, but we can also continue within the resources that we have to build evidence for the next upcoming trials. But it's unfortunately something we often have to do.
We can vouch for that experience ourselves in London. Would anyone else like to comment? Shall I move on? No? Okay. So we have all of these up here. I guess this is sort of in the same vein. Do you have any lessons for communicating trial results in a way that might improve their uptake, increase policymaker interest in behavioural science, increase chance of implementation, scale? Would anyone like to comment on that? Please.
So one thing we try to do before starting a trial is to do a pre-mortem. Okay, so generally there is kind of a thing you expect to happen when you do a randomized control trial, sometimes even something you want to happen. But we want to think beforehand, okay, what are the optional results and what are the implications? And we make sure we have that discussion with supervision as well, that they are very sure that there can also be a negative result and that they have to think about what they will do if there is a negative effect, because we don't want our randomized control trials to just be supportive of whatever was going to happen anyways. We want it to have some decisive effect. So that's a discussion we try to have before we actually do the experiments.
Thank you very much. Please.
I think that's an interesting question that I certainly don't think we have the answer to. I often find myself updating and revising the way that we're presenting, whether it is behavioral insights or behavioral science or the randomization or the experimentation portion. A few weeks ago, we had a conversation, senior leadership who said, maybe we should just not even say it's an experiment. It's like, okay, so maybe, I don't know. But I guess I think what's important, what I've learned is at the beginning to be clear that, this may not work. I think sometimes we're seen as a silver bullet, which can sometimes be really harmful for us as a practice, especially if decision makers or policy makers are feeling it's a crunch and they need to deliver on something. Well, maybe, okay, let's kind of go to this behavioral science team. Maybe they'll solve all our problems. So I think it's important at the beginning to be really clear that this is what it is. We are experimenting. We're trying different things. Some things may work. Some things may not work. But one thing that is always true is we do always learn something. So even when we find trials, we've had results where the result is actually below control, like what they were already doing. Those are the harder ones. But then we can say, okay, well, see, the good news is this is a really bad idea. So what we tested, we should not implement. And as an organization, we implement and roll out $1 million programs all the time without testing them. So I think that's also an important reminder at the outset to say what's riskier. testing it or not.
Can I add about the way of how to get this going in governments? The government of Argentina with the Macri administration starting 2015 had a very, very, very aggressive communication policy, social media, etc. So they hired one of the best consultants on how to communicate things to the citizens. And at the same time, me and the World Bank and others, we were at the White House, which is the pink house in Argentina, trying to establish a lab for evaluating policies and also using behavioral insights. And the answer was always, we're already doing that, because they were doing the communication part. So they were calling it communication, and they were sending personalized emails, social norm framing. They were doing already, but they call it differently. And so I see a positive part and a negative part of that. The positive part is that they really rolled it out and it was done in many aspects of the government, not calling it that way. But the negative part is that sometimes they didn't build up on that communication to evaluate it and to do the more behavioral field experiment.
Well, maybe to add to the question, how to sell a trial that hasn't worked. So, I mean, it's particularly a problem when you're testing ideas that come from the federal ministries or from the regulator themselves, and you test it against alternatives. And we were quite, maybe it's not surprising, but people were actually quite open and welcoming if you can explain why things didn't work. So if you take them along on a journey of iterative learning, actually they can be very, very welcoming because they save money. And this is something we have to stress, that to put the money in the right things, and most of the regulators want exactly this. So we shouldn't be so anxious to say, well, the trial has failed or not, but to really then take this as an advantage to actually step up and find out why it hasn't worked and work on the issue. So, and we've seen a quite good appetite for that, and I think the same accounts for the colleagues as well.
Fantastic. So I see one of the more popular questions is a commonly asked question around principles of behavioral science that fail to translate across borders. So I'm going to pose that one, but I'm going to expand it to include principles of structuring behavioral insights function. So in the UK, we started off with a highly centralized unit. That often doesn't translate to other teams. Different societies and governments have more or less patient/acceptability for experimentation. So feel free to take that question of translation of approaches across cultures in a broad sense. Would anyone like to comment on that?
I don't have an example of it not working, but I have an example of it working. In 2000, I guess it was 15 or 16, we ran a trial with organ donor registration. Wanted to increase rates in Ontario. At the time, rates were around 25%, even though around 89% of Canadians said they were interested in becoming an organ donor. They just weren't following through with the process. So we tested a variety of interventions. At the time, the Behavioural Insights team had released their report, and we tested the exact statement that they used, and it was, if you needed a transplant, would you get one? If so, donate today. And I remember during approvals, I had trouble getting it approved. The minister said to me, well, it's awkward. Like, the sentence is awkward. It sounds kind of strange. What do you mean? He kept reading it over and over and over again, and we were all sitting there. And we'd already been in there for 45 minutes on the other interventions, and he's like, I don't know. And I said, well, they tested it in the UK, and it worked. It was their best performing, so I think we should test it here. And sure enough, it was our best performing as well. So that was one of my highlight briefings.
It's very reassuring. It's reassuring.
Yeah. So that was sort of the good news story that came out of that. But it worked exactly the same way in Canada, which I found interesting.
Thank you.
Maybe quickly, the 401k experiments that were described in the Nudge book, we have just finished in the labor markets division, they have just finished in a lab trials, similar trials in 5 Latin American countries with millions of informal workers. That's probably what makes it so different, and zero effect. zero impact. So they didn't work in 5 different countries.
Do you hypothesize why that may be?
The informality of the workers is one of them. We are asking them to save when probably they don't have money to eat. So that although all the design of the policies was taking into account that these were informal workers, myopic culture, that's, I mean, we'll be disseminating those results, but I find that interesting that it's not only Colombia or Mexico, but it's 5 different countries in which that approach is not working.
Do we have time for one more? Okie dokie. How about, where do you see the future innovation or growth opportunities for behavioral science? And I guess this is policy areas, but techniques, new technologies that we might bring to bear. Go for it.
Maybe not. I won't answer the question directly, but I think that one thing that's going to start becoming important is having these hybrid spaces between the lab and where the knowledge about behavioral insights is being produced and what we're doing, which is very applied. And I feel like there's a bit of a disconnect because we're taking these things from the lab, these freshly tested or freshly found insights, and we're applying them. And I feel like with the replication crisis, but also with all these field experiment replications that sometimes are not working, which shouldn't discourage us because it just means that we should do more effort on that. I feel like these hybrid spaces should be created more and more. And in France, there's something like that coming up on the question of environment. So it's basically a sort of a hybrid lab where they test for external and internal validity of different experiments we're running and retest and replicate them. And I think that we really should pay so much more attention on making sure that these effects we're testing are really robust and they're not just going to die out in a few years. That's one area.
Which in some way brings us back to the original question of overcoming the sort of trade-offs between rigor and the requirement for speed of policymakers. Well, thank you very much to all our panelists. It's been a fascinating session to learn everything that you're doing. And as I say, it's genuinely overwhelming. And I hope everyone will take the opportunity to discuss further with you when they spot you around the conference. Thank you.